Welcome to our first interview with Yusuf Dirie from the University of Sussex. Brother, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
And my first question goes to you. And how did you get to research understandings of progress?
Well, I came to the study of progress mainly through the work of my supervisor, one of my supervisors at my department, called Andy Sterling. In particular, one of his papers called Pluralizing Progress. And he talks about it in terms of 3Ds. And I remember reading that and thinking to myself, much of what he was arguing spoke to me. And his critique was one that I not only found interesting, but I thought could very much be applied in the post-colonial and decolonial setting. So his paper was the entrance into the world of trying to understand progress.
Very interesting. Second part of the first question is, what is the relevance of decolonial thought within the definition of progress?
Well, I find decolonial thinking interesting because it provides you with the tools to be able to not only resist but also confront ideas of Eurocentrism. And I think this is one of the key things that anybody who falls on the side of difference, that is not European definitions of what it means to be modern, what it is to have progress and all of these sorts of things. Decolonial thinking is an interesting vehicle with which they can not only understand their situation, but it gives them the tools, the language and the concepts to be able to try to plot new trajectories that aren't necessarily just following what Europe has done.
Thank you. The last part of the question, could you give examples of communities or countries that define the limited understanding of progress differently?
I think there are examples in many places. It's one of the difficult questions is it's around, people often think that they have to give the voiceless a voice, or they have to give the subaltern a voice, rather than looking at what are the conditions that produce subalternia and what are the conditions that produce voicelessness. Now, when it comes to different understandings of progress, they exist in the world. You can look at the pastoralists in East Africa, you can look at agro-pastoralists in many different parts of the world. You can look at even communities in Brazil, for example, that are working on issues around renewable energy. They're offering different understandings of what it is to be able to move forward. So difference is the starting point. It's everywhere. The question is whether we're willing to tap into it. So I don't think it's about trying to find the concrete examples. The concrete examples are there.
Okay.
It's just about being humble enough to also be able to look at different communities and try to understand them.
Very interesting point. My next question. What do you mean by politics of imagination?
Well, the term politics of imagination has been used before. But for me, when I use it, it's to really point towards that. And this goes back to the use of decolonial thinking, that a lot of world history and modernity is this idea that starts when Europe posits itself as the center of world history. So you end up with this system where you have the center and the periphery. And the idea is that the center consistently expands and it's about incorporating the periphery into itself. The issue that I have with that, though, is that those that are deemed other, that are said to be at the periphery, are said to be a deficit. So the idea is that they lack things. They lack progress, they lack knowledge, they lack rationality. They're always defined by absence. They're defined by what they don't have. And the difficulty about that is that when you have development interventions, or you have progress, or you have any of these sorts of things spoken about in relation to the periphery, it's always done as a way of, we're helping them because we're giving them things. Because if you're at a deficit, that deficit needs to be topped up. Now, the issue with that is that it allows for trusteeship to be expanded over the so-called periphery. And what it says is that these people lack true knowledge, true understanding, true happiness. So they basically must be governed, or they must be ruled, or they must be educated so that they can learn how to be better. But the problem with that is you have a negation, a complete disqualification of their perspectives, of their understandings, and the sorts of lives that they would like to lead. But it's not done in a debate now, it's done as, I'm helping you. Okay. And if you try to resist, your resistance is only taken as confirmation of your backwardness rather than a rejection of politics. So going back to the decolonial thinking in terms of how do we move away from Eurocentrism, I'm more interested not just about moving away from Eurocentrism, but how can we move away completely from the center-periphery dichotomy and move towards an understanding where there are multiple different centers, out of which different understandings of progress, different understandings of development, and different understandings of what the future could look like emerge. And these centers are in struggle with each other for ontological priority, ontological primacy. But in order to recognize that that is the struggle that's going on, you have to recognize that there's politics involved in this. There's politics in how you think about the future, how you think about these sorts of things, but to not engage in that and do it in the sanitized debate of I'm helping you, I'm giving you development. You've depoliticized it. And by depoliticizing it, what you're actually doing is you're exercising power. You're basically saying you cannot imagine, so I will imagine for you. And that's what I'm trying to move beyond now. Many different people are capable of imagining, and it's these different alternative visions of what the future could and should look like that are in competition with each other. And I'm more interested towards moving towards a democratic system where we're able to have a conversation across our difference in order to say which one is the best for us. But in order to be able to engage in that conversation, we first need to recognize difference exists, but not in the way of looking at difference through the lens of deficit.
Wonderful. And my next question, how do we deal with the fact that marginalized communities using imagination is discouraged? And how can we promote using the ability to use one's imagination?
I think this is an interesting question, and it gets right to the heart of the matter. Now, discouraged is a term that is good to use, but the term that I like to use in this instance is disqualification. That the majority of the time is completely disqualified. And I think it's very much important that we look at the mechanics in which disqualification takes place. Because more often than not, what you find is, and this is very much building on the work of Enrique de Sal, that there's a great deal of when the center expands, it does it via a logic of emancipatory reason. I'm freeing you from that which kept you stuck in the past, that which kept you slightly backwards. So as in the Somali way of saying it would always be Ashana Hussein. Okay. So what I'm interested with, so when you have that idea, the violence that is unleashed on people that are trying to imagine alternative different ways of trying to live, it's not considered violence. It's done in complete good consciousness. It's done in good faith. It's as the philosopher Isabella Stenger says, it is a truth that is legitimately, it's the price, as Isabella Stenger says, it is the price that is legitimately demanded by truth. So these actions of disqualifications are viewed as necessary. So part of what I think our task is first and foremost is how do we delegitimize the violence? How do we move beyond emancipatory logic so that you can see it as it exists? Difference is the starting point. The world is different. We need to move beyond this logic of trying to make people more like us. Recognize difference so we can move towards a state where we can have a conversation across difference. But the question that you said was, how do we imagine these alternative?
And how do we promote the ability to use one's imagination?
Well, I think we don't really necessarily need to promote it as such, because I think there are spaces within which these different imaginaries are taking place. But I think part of what we need to do now is actually listen. Because there's that quote that there is no voiceless, there's just the people that we choose not to hear. But why are we choosing not to hear them? Voicelessness is not a condition that is natural. Nobody was born voiceless. Nobody is born wretched. Nobody is born not understanding the situation and everything like that. What are the conditions that create voicelessness? And once we understand that, I think then we'll be able to struggle against that, so that you can then go back to a state where they're here, they're talking. How can we hear that? Okay.
Can we imagine progress without capitalism? And how will that look like?
And how would it look like? So I'm going to slightly change the premise of the question. So instead of me saying how would I imagine progress without capitalism, look at it more broadly. I think there are many places in this world right now where people have imagined progress. And I consider here progress, when you take it back to its etymological roots of to move forward, that there are many people that are trying to move forward in ways that aren't conducive or work in relation to capitalism. The question for us is, how do we find those people that are already actively doing these work and learn from them? So these spaces are already in existence. The second part of the question was,
How would it look like?
how would it look like? I think we need to, once we find those spaces, we'll know what it looks like. But it's about finding the communities that do that. So the point I'm trying to say here is it's not about trying to create a one-size-fits-all solution for everything. It's about going back to that, to the noise of multiple different voices and trying to hear what others are saying. But the issue is, it's not about, I'm not interested in fundamentalism. I'm not interested in the replacing of one absolute truth, capitalism in this instance, with another absolute truth would be an alternative to capitalism. I'm more interested in how do we have a conversation, how do we see the difference that is out there as a means of trying to learn from each other so that we can then say, well, maybe this is better, maybe that is better.
Okay, do you think horumar, Somali word, is a translated loan word and therefore a concept of the colonizer? And if so, where do we have to start decolonizing?
Horumar, I won't be able to talk on the linguistic elements or roots of the word because I'm not a linguist, I don't really know. But what I think, it goes back to the first question when I said that I was very much influenced by the work of one of my supervisors, Andy Sterling, who's been very critical in my intellectual development. And part of what he talks about is that one of the important elements of progress is directionality.
Okay.
That progress, this idea that it might be a move forward, but there's many different directions that one could pursue. So just because we've said horumar in terms of moving forward, we haven't taken out of that word the element of direction.
Okay.
We still have to choose which direction in which we think is horumar and horulomar. But in order to be able to do that, we need to move out of this idea that there is only one future to which we're trying to move forward to, which is how a lot of progress is often presented when the choice is given to us. It's done in a way, and this is me very much building on the work of Andy, or using Andy's work, Andy Seven's work, it's done in a way of yes or no. How much and how fast, as he would argue. So the direction we're walking has already been decided. It's been reduced down to borrow from him again, it's a race that is run on a single track towards the future. The point for us now is to actually say, well, actually, there's many different directions that we could engage in which we could move forward. What are the costs? What are the losses? What are the benefits? All of these sorts of things that are attached to these type of choices. And in order to be having that conversation about direction, you need to recognize the politics that's inherent to this, that it is a conversation, it is a debate that will take place, and it will look good to different people and will look bad to different people, but that conversation needs to take place. In regards to the point about the colonizer, many of the ideas upon which we build are ideas that we've inherited. And part of what I think we need to start doing now is building on the intellectual tradition of Stuart Hall, is let's move. Our starting point shouldn't be theory. Our starting point shouldn't necessarily be words. Our starting point should be the real world. What are the problems that we're faced with? What are the actual material realities in which we find ourselves? And how can we use theory, or how can we use ideas as a means to help us explain what's happening around us or to us as a means to either better understand the situation or change the situation? So in that sense there, I don't think it's as much about the colonizer dichotomy when it comes to ideas, but it's about, which is still very important, but it's very much about how you use ideas. Now, if you're interested in furthering the internal logic of ideas, then you're not living in the real world. My point is let's anchor ourselves in reality, let's anchor ourselves in the land, let's anchor ourselves in our situations, let's anchor ourselves in all of these sorts of things, and then use theory, ideas, and all of that to help us better understand the situation. Because once you have a better definition of phenomenon, we can then begin to make it act in the desired manner.
Okay, wonderful. What is your final thought?
Final thoughts?
How will you summarize your whole weekend and the topics you talked about, the politics of imagination, decolonizing progress, and most of the other current topics? What is your final thought that you leave with us here in Frankfurt?
I think my final thoughts on this would be, we need to not be afraid to have conversations across difference. We need to recognize that our starting point is difference of opinion, difference of thought, difference of how we look, how we act, how we live our lives. Once we recognize that we're different, then we begin to have a conversation that isn't based on deficit, that isn't based on this idea of I can imagine, you can't imagine, I know what's better for you, I know more than you know, but let's learn from each other. let's actually have a conversation across difference, as Nancy Fraser would say. Because once we begin to do that, I think we'll be able to be in a situation where you recognize all the choice that is available to us. And once we recognize the choices that are available to us, we go into it in a more proactive and a more informed and a more conscious way. So more conversations, more dialogue, more listening, more humbleness, and recognizing that what I know isn't necessarily a universal truth.
True.
Thank you.
So we will take that as our...
Chop it up here.
And Yusuf Dirie,
No,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
The 7 teams, the 7 Nomads teams.
The 17 Nomads are there. You guys expanded over the night.